that whole movement started in 1948. There was a little town called Hollister. The San Francisco Chronicle had heard there was going to be this rally. They went up there, and just by chance, the 13 Rebels, the Galloping Goose, the Pooh Boos, the Pissed Off Bastards from Bloomingdale that became the Hells Angels later. Uh, these bike clubs are all up there, and they're raising hell. And probably not as much as the San Francisco Chronicle led on it to be, but they put it out on the wire. All these little newspapers pick it up, and now there's a controversy. Some people say the actual statement about only 1% ruined it for everybody else didn't come till almost a decade later. I don't know. I've heard both stories. All I know is I knew somebody there. There was a guy named Tom Noel. We call him the old goose. He was a galloping goose, and he was there. And, I asked him, I said, hey, Tom, what happened to Hollister? And he said, not a goddamn thing. We were up there drinking beer and partying. But the media jumped on it, sold a lot of newspapers, and, other people caught on. Well, like I said earlier, my parents moved to Camarillo thinking they're going to get me out of that environment. And lo and behold, there's a 1% Outlaw Motorcycle Club just on the outskirts of town. The question marks. And, this is a real 1% club. They're endorsed by the Hells Angels, the Satan Slaves, the Losers from Monterey, Straight Satans. This is a whole little clique of real outlaw bikers. And it's headed by Dick Woods. And Dick Woods, we called him Woogie. He was the leader of the question marks, one of the original members. And I don't know, 61 or 62, I think they started. And, they started, marking territory out. And the Hells Angels took notice of them. The Satan Slaves took notice. And soon they were kind of embraced into that 1% world. From 1966, when I met David Ortega. David Ortega is an established 1% question mark. I've just come home from the Marines. Him and I have a verbal confrontation. Thinks I'm a cop because of my hair and whatnot. And prior to that, I was kind of in high school. I was on the peripheral. I was looking in. I was watching Dick Woods. Danny Brooker and I were schoolmates. His father owned Cars of the Stars, and that's where Woogie was working out of Dick Woods. And so I had an idea and a view of them, but until I got back from the Marines, uh, that's when I really started thinking this is something I want to wrap my arms around. So I'm running around with the question marks. There's a lot of smaller clubs in Ventura County, but the question marks are dominating everybody. They've got the final say. They are a 1% club into that 1%er brotherhood, if you will. They're having 1%er meetings once a month or whatever, I'm told. I'm not part of it because I'm an independent, which back in those days, running around as an independent could be tricky, And, I'm running around with the question marks, kind of I don't want to say graduate up to the slaves, but in a sense, the slaves are more in the San Fernando Valley, in the heart of it all. But I'm still looking for that lifestyle, man. I'm thirsty, and I want to get as much of it as I can. But you got to keep in mind, in the daytime, I'm working for the Department of Defense, and at night, I'm jumping on my motorcycle, kissing my wife Cheryl goodbye, and I'll be home in time for work, and I would take off. Well, I don't know if it was common, maybe not, because I had a family. I had a wife, and I had a baby already, or baby coming, if you will, and I had kind of structure in my life, and it I don't know. I just gravitated towards that. It seemed to have a military tone to it, and but freer. You didn't have to answer to nobody. I had got in trouble in the Marines because I had this gunnery sergeant like bugging me. And in the outlaw bike world, if somebody disrespected you, you just pick a fight with them. In the military, somebody disrespects you, you pick a fight with them, you get court-martialed. So it was a whole different ball game. one of the things I said when I left the club is, man, I can't do this anymore. We've become the people we rebelled against. And, to me, it was the perfect world. It was, nobody hassled you. If somebody hassled you, you stood up to them. There was a problem, you dealt with it on the spot, and then it was forgot about. It wasn't, you didn't go home and get your gun and, hunt the guy down. Ultimately it seemed to come to that. But back then it seemed more pure to me. And it was all about the motorcycles. It was about the brotherhood. But most of all, it was about having a good time. The Saint and Slaves were good friends with the question marks. And the leader, Dick Woods, was helping the Saint and Slaves. I think it was Little John's bike from the Saint and Slaves. His bike got stolen. The Hessians had stolen it. And they were at the Sinner's Palace in Ventura, on the Ventura Avenue. This is the late 60s. And they're looking for Little John's bike. And word is the Hessians are over here, and they've got Little John's bike. And people went there early, settled the problem. There was still some hard feelings. The Saint and Slaves were all over 6 foot. They were big, tough guys. And they put it on these guys in the bar. Dick Woods arrived late, comes in the back door, and everybody's left. The Saint and Slaves have left. The question marks have left. There's a Hessian hang around there. I can't think of his name. I think he was an Oriental guy. And he stabs Dick in the back. And Dick becomes partially paralyzed, which handicaps the question marks. He's their leader. So now the question marks are in a disarray. They're not riding as often. David Ortega's gone to prison. And I continue to ride continually. And I start running into the Saint Slaves. The Saint Slaves remember me. And they start inviting me to their events. And I start hanging out down in L.A. I meet Von Dutch, who ultimately takes Dick Wood's place at the Brooker Ranch to take care of the Cars of the Stars. And the first time I really interact with Von Dutch is I'm with the Saint and Slaves, and there's a little bike club that's encroaching on the Saint and Slaves bar. Can't remember the name of the bar. And I think it was the Dew Drop-In or something on Ventura Boulevard. And the bartender tells the slaves, I'm there as well, independent. He tells the slaves, if you guys stay here tonight, when those guys show up, you run them off, I'll give you free beer till we close. So the guys show up, we beat them up, run them off, and there was a Hell's Angel there from Los Angeles that didn't know who Dutch was. And during the course of the fight, this guy had on a dog chain. He was wheeling this dog chain and smacking people with it. He cut Von Dutch's cheek open. And Bill Reed, who was a Saint and Slave, says, we got to take you to the hospital, Dutch. No way Dutch was missing free beer. He says, I'm not going anywhere. So they put him on the bar, sewed him up with needle and thread, and that was my introduction to Von Dutch, who ultimately later took Dick Wood's place working on the Cars of the Stars. I worked at a place in Oxnard called the Motor Shop. It's going to be in my new book. And it was one of the first part houses. Back then, you go to the Harley shop in the old days, they don't want to wait on you, man. You might sit at the counter and, they might never acknowledge you. So this was an aftermarket place that I helped establish. It wasn't mine, but I had a piece of it. I got paid a percentage of what I sold. And, I met Buzzard from Purdue there, Jim Passmore, Little John from the Saint Slaves, Dougie Pooh from Purdue, Vern from Oakland. That's where that all came from. So I started hanging out with the question marks, riding with them, partying with them, fighting with them, with other people sometimes. I mean, David Ortega and I were best brothers. I fought him a couple times, I mean, we would just get to partying, and one thing would lead to another, and, they were friendly fights. They weren't serious fights, but it was a wild life, It was a lot of fun. I was young. I felt indestructible, and I didn't want the party to end. Well, in the beginning, you couldn't go buy a custom-made motorcycle. You had to build it. And if you didn't build it, you got laughed off the block. I mean, there's no way you're going to show up at some sort of outlaw bike party or run on a motorcycle that you didn't build. It was paramount that you built the bike, or at least had a big hand in building it. And back then, Harley shops didn't really want us in there. They didn't want our business. So you had little guys like Dick Woods, Arlen Ness up in the Bay Area, Dean Lanza in Los Angeles. These guys were building bikes, and they had specific looks to these bikes because they were all handmade custom parts. So you could literally look at somebody's motorcycle and you could tell geographically where they were from. It was almost like an accent. So if somebody pulls in, you go, that guy's from the Bay Area. Oh, this guy's from San Diego. So each bike had its own particular style. San Francisco had these, what became known as Frisco pegs, the way they were mounted. San Fernando Valley had, the Satan Slaves had very sleek, just stripped down, very skinny bikes. I remember San Diego had big, tall Packer bars with big stack pipes. It depends. Sometimes you'd see something you liked and you'd utilize it. But you'd have to go to a guy like Dick Woods, who was making the parts, because, a lot of people didn't have that talent. But, if you had somebody assist you, that was acceptable. You just couldn't go buy an assembled bike, ride it into a run, and people aren't going to embrace it. They're going to laugh at you. And that's not your bike, that's so-and-so's bike. I remember that. I mean, bikes could be identified. It was the same thing, across the country. I'm sure I wasn't exposed that much to the Eastern bikes because I was a California boy. But I know there was a big difference between when I started spending a lot of time in the Bay Areas in the 70s. I would go up there in the 60s, but in the 70s, I spent a lot of time there. You could specifically see the difference between the Southern California bikes and the Northern California bikes. Put together a 57 Panhead that I paid $200 for. You can't even get a bike serviced now for $200. It's amazing. And it was a 57 straight leg Panhead. I wound up keeping that for a while. I wound up trading it for what would become kind of my signature bike. I rode a 80-inch flathead pretty much the first 10 years as I established myself in that outlaw world, and people identified me with that particular type of motorcycle. I had my own style. It was kind of the Ventura Oxnard style. No Packer bar, no back seat, solo ride, high bars, kind of a fat bob, low to the ground, and, suicide shift, the hand shift under the hip. That was my bike that took me on adventures with the Question Marks, later the Satan Slaves, and then later as a Hell's Angel in Los Angeles. Well, it was a real Zen experience for me because you don't think about riding, you just have to do it. If you have to think about it, it gets clumsy. So, you get on that motorcycle and you start riding. Some people had a real ability, other people were awkward and clumsy at it. But I think maybe from surfing, balance and whatnot, I just, I went on a lot of crazy rides, and I wonder how I wound up not going to the hospital.